Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studio, you are listening to For Your Consideration,
the podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm your host, Dustin Friesenan.
And I'm your host, Mike Josick, and we would like to welcome you to the latest episode of the podcast. If you are a regular listener, good to see you back. Thanks for joining us again. And if you are a brand new listener to the podcast, just a warning, spoilers ahead.
And if you're checking out our back catalog, this isn't our latest episode. Please don't hold that against us.
So as we discussed at the end of our previous episode, we were originally going to do either Ferris Bueller's Day Off or The Sound of Music. However, Dustin came in with kind of a last-minute audible in light of the fact that we have Canada Day on the 1st of July and Nunavut Day on the 9th of July.
We would end up looking at an Inuit film from Canada in celebration.
Basically celebrating Canada with a Canadian film, deciding to continue showing some diversity with including a much celebrated Inuit film. And that film is the 2001 Atanarjuat, The Fastest Runner.
AKA, You Can't Kill What You Can't Catch. A story of forgiveness, but not forgetting.
I can't think of any above-the-line news or preamble or anything to throw out, so we're going to just jump straight to the credits and start the conversation on the film. So Atanarjuat, The Fastest Runner, was directed by Zacharias Kunuk. It was written by Paul Apak Angelurk, produced by Paul Apak Angelurk, Norman Cohn, Zacharias Kunuk, and Jermaine Wong. It starred Natar Ongolak, Sylvia Ivalu, Peter Henry Arnatsiak, and Lucy Tulugarjuk. Cinematography was by Norman Cohn. It was edited by Norman Cohn, Zacharias Kunuk, and Marie-Christine Sarda. Music was by Chris Crilly, distributed by Odeon Films, released initially at the Cannes Film Festival on the 13th of May 2001, and then a Canadian-wide release on April 12th, 2002. The film has been widely praised by critics internationally, celebrated in Canada. Many have cited it as possibly Canada's greatest film. It's won a number of awards, including the Caméra d'Or at Cannes, basically where it got a lot of its attention. The film is celebrated for not only bringing fairly accurate depiction of Inuit culture and clothing and traditions, but it is also the first film ever to be written, directed, and acted entirely in the Inuktitut language.
And on the Sight and Sound list, it had made it to 894th on the critics poll, garnering but one vote.
I used to have a thing where I would talk briefly about what media we basically watched the film on, or at least I watched the film on, and that's kind of fallen by the wayside lately, but I've kind of been bringing it back. So just want to throw out that watched Atanarjuat on Netflix Canada. Not sure if it's on Netflix US or any other region internationally, but after the discussion, if anybody who hasn't seen the film is interested in going and checking it out, that is 100% probably the easiest way to access it. Being as connected as it is to the National Film Board of Canada, it's probably also available through the NFB. And being an NFB thing, it's probably available through anybody's regional libraries.
It's amazing what you can get at a library. 3D printing, green screens, full LAN parties. It's ridiculous.
So this was the first time I had seen Atanarjuat. I'm pretty sure it's the first time Dustin had seen it.
I'd only heard about it the week before.
It is something that, when I saw the poster, I've definitely seen this in the video store. It's something that has been circulating. I'd been familiar with it as an artifact. It had just never really grabbed my attention to the point where I rented it or sought it out. But here we are now, covering it for the podcast. So, Dustin, can you give us a quick summary of the film and jump into first impressions?
Atanarjuat it's a story that's sort of bookended by a curse that was placed on a couple families, the family of Oki, who then transferred it over to Atanarjuat's family. It was started by a murder of an evil person that sort of spread that evil around, and it cursed Atanarjuat's father to have just sort of a bit of a miserable life. And then it sort of skipped right into that and went to Atanarjuat meeting and falling for Atwat, who he eventually marries, in spite of Oki wanting her as well. And he pretty much uses that as a reason to just try to take down Atanarjuat no matter how. Effectively gets his sister to marry him as well as Atwat, and then she tries to break up his brother's marriage in the most absurd manner I've ever seen put to film, to be honest. And they use that as an excuse to try to kill both Atanarjuat and his brother Amakjuag. This leads to him hiding out for much of the summer before returning back home and confronting Oki and his two
goons.
At which point they get rid of the curse, but then kick out Oki and his goons after having forgiven them. As I said, they forgave, but they're not going to forget. It's like, you guys are all banished. You guys were complete turds. We forgive you, but we're not forgetting what you did, so get the heck out of here. So going into the film, I did a quick read up on what to sort of expect, and from what I understood, it is an ancient Inuit myth that the director wanted to use to sort of almost make a documentary just showing how Inuit life was. Try to make this little time capsule of a film so that would live on, his culture would live on. So I went into it thinking of it essentially as a documentary, and I think that really changed how I'm watching it, because not just as a documentary, but as a documentary told as oral tradition from an Inuit tribe. So obviously that is way out of my cultural wheelhouse, but that also made me appreciate everything that was going on within it. It's a 3-hour film?
2 hour, 41 minute, something like that.
It's a long film, but honestly, I didn't feel it being that long. Even though there are a lot of pauses, not everything moves super fast. Every scene, I was looking for stuff to sort of teach me how life was and how they would do things in life. They'd spend whole scenes building shelters. There'd be scenes where they're just mashing seal blubber into oil so that they can use it to light up these places. They cover a whole lot of different little aspects that might not be entirely relevant to what's going on, but I can almost imagine some British narrator whispering, "And now you can see how Atanarjuat is doing this in order to preserve the meat for future use." Instead, it was just show, not tell. And I found that very interesting in terms of it being sort of a documentary in my mind. And it really changed how I viewed the whole film. And there's definitely some stuff in there that I did not expect at all. Not just from a cultural standpoint, like I didn't expect them to be a polygamous society. I didn't expect the idea of them having such small tribes, such small communities, that there might be some intermarriage and even some intermarriage within the family. I could definitely see how that would go, but the polygamy was a surprise. The everybody sleeping under the same tent I could see, but I mean, when Oki's sister, Puya, tries to sleep with Atanarjuat's brother, and all 5 of them are right there, it's like, who were you trying to hide this from? Really? That was the most ridiculous attempt at cheating I have ever seen in my life.
Very brazen.
Super brazen. I thought that was just hilarious.
The thing that you mentioned about the almost documentary-like aspect of the film, it is definitely partly how they sold the film in order to get financing, because when they went looking for money, the Arts Council or whoever grants, filmmaking grants in Canada tends to look at French-speaking or English-speaking films as what they generally fund. Getting money for an Aboriginal film was not deemed as sort of commercial or having any sort of real relevance. So one of the ways they sold it was they did say, yes, this is a fictional film. Yes, it is going to be in Inuktitut, and all of these things that were essentially going to be obstacles. However, because of the accuracy it is essentially going to be almost a documentary, contextually and texturally and in every way except the fact that what these people on film are saying to each other is actually scripted. And that's ultimately how they managed to secure funding. So, like you said, I'd started the film because you told me, hey, this is what we're watching next. I was having a lot of trouble finding a way into it. And then I had to stop after about, I think, 20 or 25 minutes. And I did some reading on it. And, among many other things that I ran across, that whole thing about the documentary aspect, like you, changed the way that I was viewing the film, because a lot of the pacing and stuff and the things that could possibly be deemed irrelevant, it was like, okay, no, this is here because like this could be the only chance that this filmmaker and this crew gets to actually put this sort of stuff to film. So they were kind of doing everything that they could, throwing everything they could at the wall. And it was also there because this was a culture that people didn't really know much about. That was the texture, that was the context that these characters were existing in. I, however, did find that as a bit of a disconnect, because if it was literally just a walrus hunt or a caribou hunt, or hey, this is how the Inuit people existed day to day and built their stuff and did their whatevers, I think I probably would have been more interested and more fascinated. But because there was a narrative story underlying it, there was a dissonance there. And you mentioned the thing about the curse at the beginning. I don't honestly remember. I mean, that explains so much about the ending that I didn't get.
Well, that 20 minutes that lost you right at the beginning, yeah, it's in the time that takes place in the past with Atanarjuat's father. That's where they explain, it's very quick that they explain that there was the evil man who was killed and that evil has glommed on to the family. It was the Oki's mother, actually, who saw that evil in her family, and that's why she wanted Atwat to actually hook up with Atanarjuat, because she did not want her anywhere near her grandson.
And it's interesting too, because like that did kind of fly by me, even though I remember visually everything that happens at the beginning. I remember the guy that's tied up. I remember like the ceremony in the tent. I remember coming back from the hunt, and Atanarjuat's father is the one that is slower than everybody and doesn't have, he's not catching as much meat and isn't able to provide for his family the way others can. But we were talking off mic prior to recording about how a lot of the language, a lot of the communication, it's very abrupt, and it isn't full of a lot of description. It's very to the point. It's one of the things I super respect about this movie, because this movie sort of exists partially as a teaching tool, because like you said, this is moving the oral tradition into the cinema, and I definitely want to talk about that a little bit later, to basically show people unfamiliar with the Inuit culture, these traditions, as well as being, just something on screen to represent and teach also to Inuit peoples these aspects of the culture. I'm getting a little bit lost here. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is it's a teaching tool, but they don't spoon feed you.
They do not. I really appreciated some of the subtle things where you had to pick it up, and when I picked it up, I'd be like, oh, hey, that's interesting.
The movie does demand some engagement from you, some interactivity for sure.
And they will just throw stuff out really quickly, pretty lightning fast. Atwat's mother keeps calling her young mother because she was named after her own mother, who she believes was reincarnated. And so that's already telling you all these different facets of the spirituality in just like 2 sentences. When she simply explains that you are my mother, essentially, it demands that you think about how all of that works all together. And there's a number of other things that they will throw out at you, and you actually have to pay attention, and that sort of kept me and my mind active.
There isn't like some dramatic scene where they're sitting on a rock at night and the elder is explaining the family history to the character so that you can follow along and get the backstory and whatever. It's like, nope. She talks to her grandchild and calls him little husband. And if you didn't catch the story earlier, like the context of the little mother, you have no idea.
It does not talk down to you as an audience, that is for sure.
And that there's just this tug of war for me, because I love that. I love that it doesn't talk down. But again, I think it struggles as a narrative story. There are things in it that are very culturally specific. There are ways of speaking. There's ways of saying dialogue. As I said, it's very like to the point and very abrupt, almost to the point of being sort of terse. But they also take these long pauses. And I interpreted that as essentially inexperience with acting. And to a certain degree, it may still be a certain amount of like inexperience with acting and editing and all that stuff. But then I also found out that that is a genuine way of speaking among the Inuit, where they do take longer to respond. They do take these moments of like deep thought, and there is more done with micro expressions and just reading the face. It's more reading body language than it is describing your internal world to whoever you're talking to. That works for me, but also doesn't work for me.
The same things that you love about the film are the things that you hate about the film.
Yeah. And there's a part of me that doesn't want to hold this to the same sort of standard as, your typical North American Hollywood or even, Canadian narrative feature film, because it is kind of existing in its own place. But there's so many things that are tied into the resources they had available and the experience of the people who were making the film.
That you don't want to hold it against them, but at the same time, you got to acknowledge it.
Yeah. That's probably the best way to kind of put it. I mean,
it becomes comparable to Hala at that point, where they didn't have the pool of actors to go to, and they had to do it with censorship in mind and limited funds and resources, because you're talking out against the government in Senegal in 1971.
In this movie, I honestly don't know what the pool is for actors who can speak Inuktitut. And I don't know, I do know that the movie took 5 years to make, because the window that they had to actually film the thing, because they did film it up north. They did film it in like -30 weather, anything below -30, and the equipment freezes. It couldn't be filmed on celluloid. It had to be filmed on digital video. So it has a quality to the image that looks a little bit more like a home video camera than it does, a David Lean film, because...
But I will say that some of the shots that they had sunsets were absolutely gorgeous. When they had some of those shots where you could see everything behind them, it was some phenomenal views. He really chose some of the angles with a really keen eye.
I agree. I think there is a very interesting filmmaker being born over the course of this film. There's a scene where the summer is essentially starting to come to an end, I think. And Atanarjuat is healed up a little bit, and he's lying on the ground, and he's looking up at the sky. And basically, the scene starts with the camera pointing at the clouds and following some birds. And then it cuts away, but it doesn't cut away to anywhere sort of logical. Like, I'm kind of armchair editing, but to maybe show a shot of Atanarjuat's face looking up at the thing that you just showed on screen with calm or wonder or serenity or whatever, to me makes more sense. And there's a lot of parts of the movie that just have that sort of disconnect for me. And I don't know if that's, again, inexperience. I don't know if that's cultural, and I don't know if that's, maybe they didn't think about it on the day. And that's one of those things they discovered in the editing room where it's like, oh, we've got nothing to cut to.
Or maybe that was all frozen.
Or maybe. I do think I have explored some of Kunuk's later films, and he does show a much greater proficiency with composition and much, much more beautiful cinematography and feeling of vastness that I think a lot of people comment that this film has, and I didn't honestly feel the vastness. Did you feel the vastness?
I felt some vastness. It's like, man, that is a lot of nothing. I've worked up in the Northwest Territories, but I've never been north of the tree line, and it's just a big expanse of nothing. It's amazing that people were able to live up there at all, let alone be able to build shelters just out of the snow, crawl into them, and heat it up with so little that they're able to sit around in their underwear as a whole family. Like, I wonder how long it would have taken to build those things, and it looks like they had to rebuild them every single year.
I spent the first hour of this movie actually tense because it looked so cold, and every time they were walking, you could hear the snow crunching, which just made me feel cold and tense and uncomfortable.
Did that end at the scene which would have been the absolute coldest, where after his brother is killed and Atanarjuat escapes, he's running buck naked through the snow and ice and falling in the water? It's like, there's no way that is anywhere in the double digits even. That would have been so friggin' cold. I just couldn't imagine.
I think he had to do that a couple times too.
Oh, 100% he had to do that a couple of times. To get the shot right, yeah, that would have been absolutely insane. I couldn't help but think how cold that would be. Non-stop.
It did amaze me. Almost every frame of that movie, I just kept thinking, like, why? Why do people live there? Why would you stay? It's so inhospitable.
But then again, we live in Canada anyway.
We do. I mean, we do get a lot of snow here in Edmonton as well. But something that I did actually kind of dig and I thought helped the film for me, because it sort of had that very handheld, very documentary, verite sort of style, having the music underscoring it, for me, really helped in moments where I needed to sort of buy into it as a drama, as a fictional narrative. And it was really interesting. And it was also kind of strange how they would go with a lot of really traditional, like, throat singing and drumming, but then you would have these very folksy violins, like fiddle music, and it works. It does work.
It absolutely does work. But it doesn't feel janky.
No.
When it should.
No, I mean, it's enough that it stood out, where you're like, wait a minute. But there you go. But I really enjoyed the score, and I wondered how you felt about it.
I remember actually noticing the score in a positive way when I was watching it, which says something, because I don't normally notice scores unless they're sort of extreme in one way or another. And I do remember enjoying it. I remember for the first half of the film thinking, okay, the Inuit are one of 3 cultures that I'm aware of that do throat singing. I wonder if they'll have that, and they did, and I was very happy that they did. Especially since some of the earlier songs were like Okie trash talking, which is just ridiculous. It's almost like they threw down a rap battle going on there.
That head punching thing was interesting. That was another thing where, like, very little context. It's just all of a sudden we're going to, like, strip down and hit each other in the heads, and you realize, oh, okay, no, they're...
That's how they hash this out. Instead of having people angry, it's like, all right, we'll get it all out there, then it's over, move on with your life. And if you're in such small communities, you can't go around with grudges all the time. And I think that's the big message of the film. I sort of saw it as an Aesop's fable almost, in that this is how we have to treat each other in order to get by and survive. We forgive, we don't forget, which is why they had to be kicked out. And they just sort of wish them best. They're not going to kill or imprison people. It's, no, this is how you survive in this place. Even when Oki is a asshole murderer.
Until he eats that weird rabbit.
And that's another thing. When I read that it was a myth, I was expecting a lot of the supernatural. I didn't know exactly what to expect, but it was definitely very subtle. You had bits of the reincarnation, you had the curse, you had Atanarjuat's brother, after being stabbed to death, waking him and warning him, giving him a sort of a chance to escape by distracting Oki. Just for that split second there. You had the brother being summoned from far away when the sister needed him. Just very small, subtle things that give it a little bit of spirituality when otherwise it's fairly grounded. And I thought that very interesting.
It was. And because of the previously discussed not talking down or spoon feeding, it's definitely something that you sort of have to be paying attention to. Like at the end when she's summoning a spirit or she's talking to a spirit, it basically just sounds like a voice outside the igloo. And it may very well have been an actor standing outside the igloo talking. But you have to sort of be following along and you have to sort of be paying attention to realize that that's like a spirit voice that's talking to her. They don't put any like effects on it. Like it's not.
The only effect that was there was when the spirit faded away, and that's the only point where it was like, oh wait, that was supposed to be an actual spirit. I thought it was symbolic up until that point.
That last sequence with like the walrus fight, the evil spirit and the dude with the walrus teeth and all the noise, it kind of reminded me of like the craziest parts of Exorcist 2.
I can see that now, actually, now that you mention it.
I did feel, yes, this is supposed to be a myth, and by myth, it also is supposed to have these supernatural concepts in it. And because there are these long stretches where you're just dealing with the day-to-day life, you get to this point where you end up kind of embroiled in the story of the relationships. And they're not really overt about the whole rabbit thing. Just people notice that Oki is acting different. And it might be because the older guy was doing the thing, jumping around with the two rabbit's feet. He may have sent a rabbit spirit or something to go and put a whammy on Oki. I don't know.
Or maybe it was just, I thought it could have just been Oki being like, let's just pretend like we didn't kill his brother and try to murder him and see how that goes.
Exactly. And that's kind of how I thought it was at first until people started saying like, is he okay?
He ate way too much of that rabbit.
Yeah.
Something's going on here.
And he does a thing where he lies down for 30 seconds and then he gets up again and he's like, what a good sleep. I had so much good rabbit. But then you go into that whole full thing with the walrus teeth and the evil spirit who vanishes. And it's a lot of spirituality in a film where for the last hour and a half there's been none or virtually none.
Yeah, the bookends of the film are pure spirituality.
And it kind of... it's probably my greatest criticism of the film, the inconsistency in the narrative. And this is probably a good place to come in to talk about the oral tradition and how this film is trying to express a lot of things that are normally expressed as part of an oral tradition and moving it into a cinematic forum.
While simultaneously trying to encapsulate the culture.
For starters, I think that whole teaching thing means there's a lot of stuff in there that is technically sort of distracting from what is the fictional narrative. And I think there are issues with the pacing as far as, I mean, you have to do work with this movie. You can't just passively watch it. But I think you might have to do a little bit too much work. When you look at the oral tradition, I actually recently was having a discussion with somebody about oral traditions and not writing things down and why you wouldn't want to write things down. And they were saying that the reason why these cultures don't want to write things down is because you can write it down and you can pass it on and somebody might read it and it's the instructions, but you don't have the context to it. So when somebody is actually passing on the stories, passing on the traditions orally, they're also there to essentially be a mentor. They're also there to not just give you the knowledge, but to show you how to use the knowledge.
They can help you understand as an individual as opposed to something which is more codified. If you want to look at a more Western example, you can look at the Bible, which was oral tradition until it was actually written down and put together in the 400 AD, give or take. And I mean, there's a solid 20 pages on crop rotation in there for anyone who's read it. If you want pacing issues, yeah. 20 pages on crop rotation.
An interesting thought exercise that came out of the conversation that I had about oral traditions, because I made the exact same point. That person, first century Christianity, was very much an oral tradition. It was regional. Everybody had their own ways of celebrating the death and resurrection of Christ.
Until they brought it all together and decided, okay, this is the one truth, and now we have hundreds of different sects.
And it had to be codified to basically present to the Romans. Because the Romans were all about law, they were all about things being written down and, you know, there being rules and yada, yada, yada. So it's like, okay, we got to explain this to them so that they don't just think we're crazy and they don't just like wipe us out. We have to like prove that we're legit. So they codified Christianity and made it into a book, essentially. How fascinating is it to think about, what if that pressure wasn't there to codify it? What if Christianity just remained like an oral tradition? Would it have stuck around? Would it have just been like some weird offshoot that's like some people somewhere out in the Middle East or somewhere like is still following? Or would it still have grown into internationally recognized religion, or would it have just faded?
Would it have been as aggressive in its spreading? Would it be so aggressive in the wars and the justifications for trying to evangelize the entire world if it weren't quite as codified? Would people be more understanding, with the understanding that not everything is solid and concrete? And I think it absolutely would be in that sense. Because, I mean, what you're raised with, if you see the same thing over and over again, I've heard of elders getting together and discussing their versions of stories and how they use it to teach. And I love that concept because I remember working at Tim Hortons and having a discussion with somebody and saying that Jesus Christ wasn't white, but all they'd ever seen was pictures of white Jesus. They started crying. Like, I shattered their entire worldview because it was so codified. Whereas you even look at the teachings of Jesus, and he spoke in parables. He didn't give you the answer. There wasn't a direct answer. Uncertainty was important. Having the different stories and oral traditions, I think it's important. You have the concept, and you're able to apply it to your life, and your life changes. It's not the way it was 2,000 years ago. The oral traditions for the Inuit, their life now is different, but if it's an oral tradition, they're able to tell Atanarjuat in a way that it's still very relevant to their day-to-day life. And that is something in an oral tradition that we lose by codifying it. While at the same time, having it codified, such as in this film, helps it last longer, especially if you've only got 40,000 people left.
It's an interesting loophole. And as soon as I learned that part of Zacharias Kunuk's mission statement was, there's a culture, there's traditions that are going away, and by putting them on film, you're sort of cheating it. It's not written down. You get to actually see people doing the things. You get to actually see, what the stuff is. It's not like just being handed IKEA instructions. However, there is still enough of a disconnect with cinema, with a film. It is visual, it is audio. You do get to see that sort of stuff, but you can't ask the film questions. You still have to, I'm the type of person who will go in and dig, but there's a lot of people who won't go and dig further. But I find it interesting that cinema is an interesting loophole for sort of carrying on and codifying, putting down oral traditions, but it's still an imperfect form of that. And I think that is an aspect of the film that I kind of marvel at and admire, but also feel that it's something of a detriment in the overall experience of watching the film. Do you have a take on that?
I don't necessarily see it as a detriment, but as I said, the way I've always rated and compared films, it's always to other films of its ilk. When I watch a horror movie, I think, how is this a good horror movie? I'm not comparing it to a comedy. I'm not comparing it to Citizen Kane. I'm not comparing it to anything that's not in its wheelhouse, because it's supposed to do one thing. Is it succeeding at that goal? That's why when we do something like A Clockwork Orange, I say he didn't succeed at his goal. I don't think he even knew what his goal was, based off of how the storyline sort of went. But looking at Atanarjuat, I feel that he succeeded in his goal. I don't feel that there's that much of a disconnect, because even if you're going and looking at it as not being a perfect example of oral history because you can't speak to that person and figure out what stuff you're missing, you're still looking at it as a film, and you'll sort of make those changes yourself slightly. You'll know that, okay, now I have to go talk to someone, but I'll have the questions I need. You'll have a starting point as opposed to just being a complete goon out in the middle of nowhere. The last thing I will say is that when Pooja comes in crying, nobody was buying that nonsense. And I thought it hilarious that everyone else was just staring her down. They didn't want to call her out for her BS, but you could tell that they were just like, shut up. We forgive you because that is who we are. We know you're a turd. We forgive you. But please just shut up. Stop those crocodile tears. We are so done with you right now. I loved that look on their faces. It was fantastic.
I actually love Atuat. I thought she was great.
I can't think of anything bad she did.
No. She brought a lot of nice texture, and so many other characters were kind of wonky and all over the place, and she was just...
I could even feel the affection between her and Atanarjuat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially at the beginning when they were playing Wolf and Skin or whatever it was.
I wolf you.
I wolf you.
I do have one last thing that I want to say as well, and that is I have never seen so much snot in a film as I did in Atanarjuat.
Especially on the kids.
Oh, but even the adults, like, I mean, any moisture and just being out in the cold, I mean, it makes your nose run. But
the
like
facial hair, just so much ice.
I know.
You knew that they were out in that cold. They weren't pretending like you see in Hollywood films. That wasn't added on. That appeared naturally. Those are real icicles.
Oh, we should also...
Snotsicles.
We can't not talk for like a minute about the costumes. Because they researched, they went and found... I mean, for everything. For the techniques of building the igloos and the tools used. And they had a couple of ladies that they brought in who sewed all those costumes. And they're all made like in the traditional style. And they're fascinating to see, and they're authentic, and
it's hilarious to watch the 6-year-old kid bundled up in all that trying to follow anyone around.
I thought everybody in this film was like fairly rotund initially, and I thought maybe that's because you're living up in the cold, and maybe you just have like some extra layers of fat, and you're eating a lot of like fatty foods and whatever. But then like they come out of the uniforms and these dudes are ripped. and the ladies, looking great. Like everybody's in good shape. It's just the clothes are so bulky, and they're so...
It was actually kind of odd to see when they put the kid in the almost the Bjorn, just the...
On the back?
On the back. The kid was naked underneath. Yeah. And he just slid him right in.
I just thought, like, what if the kid goes pee? Do they just pee down the person's back?
Yeah, you have kids. You know exactly how this works. I've been peed on a number of times.
Even after you had a kid. Boom. Yeah, I just thought there should be a shout out, and I wanted to say that I really loved the costuming and the dedication to authenticity, and if you had a response to that at all.
I will use that as the segue. That authenticity, and thinking of it as an oral tradition inspired documentary that's sort of native to the Inuit, looking at it as a masterpiece or museum piece. On one hand, any documentary, pretty much by its very nature, is a museum piece, because that's why you're making it. But even within documentaries, you can compare and contrast, and I am surprised at how much that I think I learned from this film about Inuit culture, and how even as almost a 3-hour film, it actually kept me watching and paying attention the entire time, which, as you said, you kind of need to do. I think that this actually falls into masterpiece. It is a film that is well worth taking a look at if you ever want to learn anything about Inuit culture. And even if the story itself has its flaws, it's not so uninteresting that you couldn't watch it on its own. Though it would be far more difficult to not be wanting to learn.
And for me, I think a lot of the stuff that I've previously discussed with sort of the tug-of-war, the stuff that I love is also stuff that I somewhat dislike about the film. I think sort of as a document, as an artifact of oral tradition of this Inuit culture, even of just having a film fully in Inuktitut, that's great. And I'm thrilled that it exists. I'm so glad that they managed to squeak the funding. I wish they would have gotten more money. It's a shitty system that basically goes, oh, there's no market for Aboriginal films.
Even though it won all these awards all over the place.
Well, they didn't know that at the time, and then now
they never do.
Now that it does, there's a precedent. But I mean, it's still shitty. They're still Canadians, and they're still looking for funding from a Canadian funding board. And they're
they produced Bubbles galore, for Christ's sake.
But as a fictional narrative film, I do think it kind of fails, and I do think that there's sort of too much pulling in different directions for me, and as I stated earlier, I did explore some of Kunuk's later films, and he's just showing such a greater mastery of the camera and composition and cinematography. And I feel like I would more likely choose one of his later films as a masterpiece than I would this. I think this is an amazing first film out of the gate. So glad that it got made. So glad that it exists. I love the fact that so many people love the movie and that it's gotten as many awards as it has, because this kind of like attention and the accolades, that's what you need to set a precedent to get more of these things made. And they did. They continued making movies, even though the production company they created has officially become insolvent and closed down. But they're still out there. All of these people in front of and behind the camera are still making films in Canada, and that is like the best news ever. However, I'm going to have to say museum piece for Atanarjuat, the fastest runner.
I guess we can just agree to disagree.
That was a lot of preamble for that.
Sometimes it's really hard to get across how much, you can appreciate something, but still sort of undercut it. It just, honestly, if and again, we talked about cultural differences and differences in storytelling, and it might just be that for me. And it also could be like 100%, had I sought this out, one Saturday afternoon and just been like, man, I really want to see this movie I've heard so much about, I might have gone into it also with a different mindset, but also...
And it is always tricky. Expectation can change everything in a film. Had I gone into it without thinking of it as this sort of oral history style documentary, would I have gone with a masterpiece? It's impossible to say.
And I think that first 25 minutes to an hour of the film is probably what ultimately sort of dislodged me, because I definitely enjoyed the film more once it kind of got going, and once, everybody was grown up and the relationships were starting to play into things. And I think I had too much of a disconnect there at the beginning, and yeah.
Well, let us know what you guys think, I guess, because we have fallen onto one masterpiece, one museum piece. You guys have to break the tie for us.
But again, museum piece does not mean it's a bad film.
Never said that.
No, but just...
Bad film is when we voted off the island.
So yeah, like Dustin said, let us know your thoughts. You can hit us up on our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Check out FYC Show or For Your Consideration. If you want to support the show while you're there, like, follow, subscribe, and share on the social media accounts and individual episodes, things that you think are cool. If you think somebody else might enjoy an episode or the show in general, share it with them. Word of mouth is a wonderful tool for spreading the word. Also, on those social media platforms, if you're enjoying the show, if there's an opportunity to rate and review, please rate and review, because it does help with the algorithms, and it does help get the show into the eyes and ears of people who may be interested in the content but aren't aware that we exist.
Like so many others.
And honestly, two white dudes who were roommates sitting down and talking about movies is like the most cliched podcast idea. So if we're hitting it out of the park for anybody, that is a huge win. And we appreciate you. So
that's why after 5 years, we're still going.
Oh, it's more than 5 years now.
8 years?
It's 6 or 7.
Six or 7. Time is meaningless after you have a kid. That's what I'm noticing.
And a pandemic. So next episode, we are going to go back to what we had previously discussed. We will be talking about Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And maybe since Dustin had the last 2 picks, I might be able to pick the next one too.
I will allow this.
Also want to just drop, by the time you're hearing this, Dustin and I were planning to record an audio commentary to celebrate the release of Thor: Love and Thunder, talking about one of my favorite Thor films, which is Thor: The Dark World. Also a film that a lot of people shit on. So love having an opportunity to sit and talk about a movie and kind of defend it to some degree to Dustin, because I know Dustin doesn't also adore it. But that should be floating around out there somewhere. So if you're listening to this and that sounds remotely interesting to you, check that out as well. It'll be on the feed in the back catalog. And yeah, that's all I got.
So until next time, I've been your host, Dustin Friesenat.
And I've been your host, Mike Josic. Hope everybody's safe, healthy, and happy. We'll see you on the next episode For Your Consideration.
Take care for now.
Ciao.
I like Mike's confused look there for a second. What the hell is he talking about?
You're like, what if we're 200 episodes past this and somebody's listening to this?
Then it's not the latest episode. I don't want to be accused of lying. But I will be accused of wasting time.